ever, kids are experiencing many forms of trauma. If we are going to be a safe place, if we are going to create the type of relationships we want, we need to know how to speak to those who have been through the unspeakable.
We would like to introduce you now to Joe Harvey Hall. He's the Keep Safe Director in the Eastern Territory, and today he's going to present a workshop for us on trauma-informed care.
Quick warning, there is a lot of information in this workshop. You may want to pause every now and then or come back to watch it later.
We hope this weekend has been valuable to you. We would like to thank Joe, we would like to thank Tom Shefshunas, our awesome youth department team for putting all of this together. And as always, you can get in touch with us on social media and as we're out in the division.
Thanks again for joining us, and know that we are praying for you as you continue to revolutionize your ministries to meet the needs of your young people.
Bye.
Bye.
Why did you? You want me to leave that in there?
No.
Hello everyone, this is Trauma-Informed Salvation Army Ministries, prepared for the Salvation Army USA Central Territory, Eastern Michigan Division. My name is Joe Harvey Hall. I am the Keep Safe Director for the Salvation Army USA Eastern Territory. Keep Safe is our child and vulnerable adult protection program. I grew up attending the Salvation Army in Arizona, which was located in the Southwest Division of the Western Territory. In my time in the Western Territory, I had the opportunity to serve as a residential camp director and a divisional child safety consultant in the Hawaiian and Pacific Islands Division. During that time, I was also trained as a territorial child safety consultant trainer. And prior to moving to New York to assume this position, I had the opportunity to work at Kroc Center, Hawaii, where I oversaw programs such as a licensed daycare center, arts programs, performing arts programs, athletic programs, day camp programs, and so on. So my experience in youth serving organizations is quite vast, and I enjoy what we do in the Salvation Army to serve youth. I also have a graduate degree in child advocacy and public policy, and I am also a certified Presidium Guardian. It is an honor to be able to present with you today. I wish that we could do this in person, but the current conditions do not allow for that. But I am thankful for technology and the opportunity to share this important consideration that we need to be integrating into our ministries. So it is an honor to be with you today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. As we jump into the information today about being trauma-informed in our ministries, I just want to say that the first part of this workshop, I really want to kind of focus on understanding trauma, where it comes from, and why it's important that we begin thinking about applying this in our ministries. Now, I'll also start by saying or sharing this disclaimer: I am no expert on trauma-informed care. I'm no expert on being trauma-informed in ministry. But what I will say is that in the research that I've done and what I've heard and the training that I've had, is that it is something that is becoming more prominent in how we conduct our ministries, especially now, since we are, hopefully, prayerfully coming through the backside of a horrible pandemic, which really added a lot more trauma to not just children, but adults alike. And so I say that not being an expert in trauma because I don't think that we can realistically expect everybody in Salvation Army programming to be experts in trauma-informed care. If you can take one nugget away from this workshop today, is that if you have enough awareness based on the information that I'm presenting to you, that you may be able to locate the resources that you need, or that you're just a little more aware in your programs and how you might be responding to people who are trauma affected. I want to start today just as a baseline with a little case study. Well, not a little case study that came out of the camp that I ran for 15 years. And I think that if you are in any kind of ministry, particularly my experience focuses on youth ministry, you're going to have those situations, those incidents that just never really leave you. We deal with a lot of things in ministries, um, whether it's a corps officer, whether it's a camp director, youth leader, the different populations we serve. There's always going to be that one instance in your ministry that always comes back to you. And this is the one that comes back to me continually. And I always think about it. I always think about, how we could have done things differently, how we could have handled it differently, but it also comes back to me to really as a reminder of some of the populations that we're serving and the trauma that they may be coming with. So in this particular situation, the fact pattern follows a camper who is 8 years old who came to camp. And for the most part, he was pretty good. His behavior started to escalate towards the end of the camp. And it came to a point where he exploded in the cabin. And by exploded, I mean he was full of anger and rage, unlike anything I have seen in an 8-year-old before. Language spewing out of his mouth that I never would have would have imagined coming out of an 8-year-old. And I believe that he was triggered by another camper saying something to him that he didn't like. And that's what started the explosion. And he, in his fit of rage, grabbed the broom that was in the cabin and started swinging it. And to just give you an idea of the cabins at the camp that we ran, they're relatively small, and you could say, to best explain it, an adult could stand in the middle of the room and extend their arms from side to side and almost be able to touch the bunk beds. I mean, it was pretty close quarters. And if you imagine this incident happening in the middle of the cabin, the beds all surrounded the side walls of the cabin. And so as the program director came in to intervene, the camper, still in his fit of rage, grabbed the pitcher of water that we put in the cabins during their rest time so that they're getting their regular hydration throughout the day. He grabbed that pitcher of water and tried to hit the program director in the face with it or over the head with it, and ended up breaking the water pitcher on the program director's arm because he was able to block it. It is a plastic water pitcher, but it still hit him with quite a bit of force. The counselors jumped in and decided that they needed to restrain the camper to the floor so that they could get the other campers out of the cabin, to which he began spitting. Now, I will just pause right here and let you know that the policy in the Western Territory is that you do not restrain children unless you are certified to do so. However, in this particular situation, they were acting in their best judgment to get the other children out of the cabin. And so, as I said, that the camper began spitting on the counselors into their faces. So they grabbed, without looking, a piece of clothing to lay over the camper's face so that they wouldn't have the spit in their face. It just so happened that the item happened to be underwear. Unfortunately, they didn't realize it at the time, but they needed to get him to stop spitting on them. So once they were able to get the camper calmed down a little bit and get him to go outside, he ran outside and he went right behind the maintenance area and grabbed a shovel and came at our maintenance director. And I will tell you, our maintenance director was a bodybuilder, surfer. He was like a wall. And I just, as I think back on that situation, that there was so much rage in this little 8-year-old. He had no fear going up against this huge man that just would scare me if I was in that situation going up against him. But but he went after the maintenance director with the shovel. So when we made contact with the mother, um, she was resistant and she was refusing to come to camp to get the camper. We clearly had a whole camp that was evacuated from the cabin area and over into another program area because this child was so enraged. Our office was across the street, probably an acre or two away. And when we came out of our office, we could hear this kid screaming and swearing and cussing from that far away. It was that loud. Um, in the midst of this, a staff member suggests calling the police. This elevated the camper's rage even more. And he became even more enraged and was coming after the maintenance director again. Again, more spitting, more swearing, more cussing. Well, when the camper's brother finally arrived to pick him up, after it was probably 2 hours, um, when the brother finally arrived to pick him up, we kind of had a better understanding of what that child's life was at home. Just with the demeanor that the brother presented, the people that the brother brought with him to pick him up, it was just, you could see that it wasn't the best home. And in the Salvation Army, we know that we are serving very different populations, and certainly our camping program is about providing camp to those who wouldn't otherwise be able to go to camp. So a few minutes later, the brother returns to the camp office and wanted to know why our camp staff shoved dirty underwear down his brother's throat, trying to gag him. So obviously the story was different right there. Well, all of this triggered an investigation. And what I want to do is just kind of leave this particular situation right here with you as we go through the information we're presenting, and we will wrap this up at the end of the presentation and find out what the outcomes were in this particular case. What we have to begin with as we're understanding trauma, and also as we're understanding how we go about protecting children and vulnerable adults in our program, is that it's important that we have an organizational culture of safety. Presidium suggests that organizational culture of safety is established when leadership is committed and vocal. That means that leadership in top levels understand the importance of protecting the vulnerable and having those practices in place that help us do it, the tools that we need to be able to do it. Our policies are clear and they're enforced, and everyone knows that safety is a part of your job. Now, in this particular group that I'm speaking to right now, I don't know what your makeup is. I don't know if it's all officers. I don't know if it's a mix of officers and lay leaders, youth pastors, whoever's around the table today. But what I would say is that I think that a lot of times in Salvation Army programming, everybody looks to the Corps officer as the go-to person who is responsible for safety all the time. And really, it's not fair to a Corps officer to have all of that piled on them. Yes, the buck does stop with them or the program director, but we need to be empowering people to understand that safety is a part of everyone's job, and everyone takes warning signs that they may see seriously, whether it be something of an abusive nature or whether it may be a child that is struggling with some behavioral issues, that through our training and through our understanding of our policies, that we're taking warning signs seriously and we're talking to people about it. Everybody has an opportunity to report their concerns, and all personnel's engagement is high, because this really contributes to an environment where the vulnerable can come and thrive, and they can reach hopefully we can steer them in a direction of resilience. I'm always so moved by stories that you hear, particularly that come out of our music camp programs, where a kid from the streets came to the Salvation Army because of that music camp program, and their life may have been in shambles, but because of the program and the environment that we had around them, they're officers today, or they're music directors today, or they're doing other youth ministry. Those are the stories that we want to see, and we want our programs to produce more people like that. Culture is the soil in which everything in an organization lives and dies. If you're good with planting, with gardening, I'm not. I tend to kill every plant that I come into contact with, and there's nothing really that's fully alive in our house. We have maybe one plant that has survived over the years, but you know that if you have a rich soil, it's going to be rich for producing beautiful plants. But if you think that about that in an organization, if we don't have a rich soil of a culture of safety within our organization, we're going to have problems. Diane Langberg, who is one of my go-to people on the subject of uh, child protection within the church, but also just an expert on trauma. And we're going to see some more stuff by her today, but definitely check out her website because she's got a lot of information and training there as well too. She says that culture is like oxygen. It's the air that you breathe. And like breathing, we never stop to think about what we are inhaling unless the air is so nasty we're forced to. It's amazingly easy to be both acclimated to the surrounding culture and blinded by it. And so a lot of what I do in my work, and certainly what I'm hoping to instill in you today, is a sense of awareness. The more that we can be aware, the more that we are going to catch things that could be problematic for us in the future, but also we're going to catch things where it provides us an opportunity to provide care that may be needed. When we talk about trauma, I want to just give you some general definitions here. Again, I think if you do some research in this area, you will see that there's a lot of stuff out there, and I don't want to overload you with too many clinical terms, but I do want you to be aware of some of the general terminology associated with trauma. First of all, trauma is a term to describe distressing events that may have long-lasting harmful effects on a person's physical and emotional health. Sorry, not health. Complex trauma, or sometimes it may be referred to as compound trauma, is exposure to more than one form of trauma, whether physical, sexual, emotional, neglect, domestic violence, or sudden loss. I think what's important for us to understand here, there's also a term in child advocacy that's referred to polyvictimization, which generally is associated with child sexual abuse. That there's not just one form of abuse that's happening; it's usually a string of abuse events that are taking place. And generally, somebody who is dealing with a lot of trauma, they are going to have more than one instance in their life that contributed to that trauma. But it's also important to say that trauma does not just come from child sexual abuse. Trauma can come from a sudden death in someone's life that a child is close to or an adult is close to. Trauma does not discriminate between child and adult. It is ever present, and it can happen to anybody. But generally, exposure to more than one form of trauma, and certainly over the course of time, it can manifest in different behaviors as well too. Adverse childhood experiences. You've probably heard about ACEs. ACEs are a subset of childhood conditions that have been consistently associated with long-term negative effects. Both behavioral problems like substance abuse and depression and physical health problems such as heart disease are associated with ACEs. The working model to explain the effects is that ACEs have a particular developmental toxicity and reprogram the stress response system and neurodevelopmental processes. essentially what we're saying here is that trauma has an impact when we're talking about children on their brain development. And so it's important to understand that when you think about all of these forms of trauma, that they are building something into the child or the adult that's going to affect their responses in society. When we talk about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed care is adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. And when we think about what you will see a lot as far as trauma-informed care is concerned, is that there are the four R's. And we're gonna look at these four R's a little bit later, but the four R's are to realize, to recognize, to respond, and to resist. Whenever we listen to the memories of trauma from others, we must do so with respect and humility, knowing that no vocabulary is sufficient for communicating the whole experience. I love the illustration that the iceberg gives us, because what we see on the surface is generally attached with something that is so much deeper. And there's a lot of reasons for that. People who are in trauma, and this goes the same for sex abuse victims. That what we see on the top of the surface may be very small in comparison to what's going on under the surface. And so, in a lot of situations, folks that are trauma affected, or children that have been abused, adults that have been abused, they're only showing us what they want us to see, but also what is happening on the surface may manifest in the behaviors that we may be having to deal with, or that we may see or experience with somebody in trauma. I think that this is a great illustration of what goes on in the brain of somebody who is trauma affected. Um, if you've watched the Hoarders show, sometimes I get sucked into that show when there's nothing else on, and it's kind of like a train wreck. You just can't pull yourself away from it. But if you look at this room, um, that's it looks like a hoarder probably lives here. But in my mind, I like to have things organized. If I walked into this room, it would give me so much anxiety that I probably would not be able to function. But the thought of even starting to clean this mess up provides anxiety to you, to just think about, where do you start? But when you think about this as being the brain of somebody who's affected by trauma, you can see it's not as simple as just saying, stop that behavior or don't have that anxiety. There's a lot more to it. And you can also see that to clean up this kind of a mess, and sort through all of this stuff, it's going to take time. Similarly, somebody who is dealing with a lot of trauma in their lives, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And that's why it's important when we talk about being trauma informed in our ministries, is understanding that we have to come alongside people. A lot of us are not clinical people, and we're not qualified to specifically deal with some of the issues that may come out of somebody who's affected by trauma, but our awareness really can help in how we continue to interact with them, how we safely program with them, how we minister to them. Some of the long-term effects of trauma include it impairs memory, concentration, new learning, and focus. I think that I may have already forgotten, but what research suggests is that trauma at a young age does have an impact on brain development. There's a lot of other physical realities that come with it too. It is correlated to heart disease, obesity, addiction, pulmonary illness, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, and cancer. It disrupts emotion, identification, ability to self-soothe yourself, or control expressions or emotions, ability to distinguish between what is safe and what is unsafe. And it shapes a person's belief about themselves and about others. It shapes their ability to hope, and it also shapes their outlook on life. This slide may be a little bit difficult to see. I know it's kind of small, but this is just kind of a diagram that um, that associates with the impact of childhood trauma. And I will see if I can get a copy of this that you guys can share as a handout. But it basically is really talking about the impact of childhood trauma and how it lands with cognition, physical health, emotions, relationships, mental health, behaviors, and brain development. And it's really kind of laid it out, and there are points under each one of these that are probably too small for you to see, but we'll see about getting that in a handout for you. But that just helps you understand a little bit more about how trauma can impact people. Now, I will say that there are varying degrees of trauma, and it doesn't necessarily mean that every person that you meet is going to have all of these factors associated with their trauma. But some people who have really have, especially when you're talking about complex trauma and other forms of trauma that have come against them, that they may have a lot of these indicators. The human ecology of early risk. We must realize that the habitat of the child at risk includes family, friends, neighborhood, church, and school, as well as less immediate forces that constitute the social geography and climate. For example, the laws, the institutions, and the values and the physical environment. I want to show, I believe the next slide is a short video that I'd like for you to view concerning the human ecology of early risk.
What is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory? Bronfenbrenner believed that a child's development was affected by everything that surrounds him or her. Through this, he created an ecological system which consisted of the microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem, and the chronosystem. The first layer is the microsystem. The microsystem is the smallest and most immediate environment in which the child lives in. Examples of these environments would be home, school and peer groups, and their community. Mesosystem is defined as the relationships between the microsystems. For example, the linkages between home and school, peer group and family, or family and church. For example, if a child's parent is actively involved in the friendships of the child, then the child's development is affected in a positive way. However, if a parent is mean towards the child's friend, then the child will have conflicting emotions, affecting them in a negative way. Exosystem is the relationships that may exist between two or more settings, one of which may not contain the developing child but affects him indirectly nonetheless. Like, for example, a parent who asks for a promotion at work and gets turned down might take out that anger on the child at home. Macrosystem is the largest system. It contains all of the distant people and places that significantly affect the child. It is made up of the child's cultural patterns and values, specifically the child's dominant beliefs and ideas, as well as political and economic systems. For instance, A child in a war zone area will experience a different kind of development than a child who lives in a community where peace is present. The chronos system relates to the transitions and shifts in one's lifespan. It may also involve the social historical context that may influence a person. A classic example of this is how divorce, as a major life transition, may affect not only the couple's relationship but also their child's behavior. Thank you for watching.
I'm always fascinated with this with Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. That's, as the video stated, within the microsystem we see the factors around the child that are meant to be protective, and we see opportunities for trauma within the microsystem, which may be affected by connections through the mesosystem, and with the exosystem and macrosystem and the chronosystems. But if we look at the microsystem, if you can see this diagram clearly, that is the system that is directly around the child, and those are meant to be the protective factors around the child, where you're talking about the school, the peers, health services, family, religious organization, the daycare facilities, the neighborhood playground. We hope that within the microsystem that all inputs are leading to protecting the child. And then, as you go out into the mesosystem, connecting to the exosystem, where you're getting into that more broader area of factors around the child that may form who they are. But I think that you can see, within each one of these systems, there are opportunities for trauma to be present. If you look at, in the microsystem, if you have a religious organization that is not safe for the child to be with, or you have a school system where it's not safe for the child to be, peers that may not be speaking life into the children, or family issues, which we know a lot of children are dealing with those, the socioeconomic status of the family and the neighborhoods that they're living in. So sometimes those things that are meant to be protective factors around the child, there are opportunities for trauma to occur as well. Within the human ecology of early risk, we're going to look at a quick look at a public health model. And I don't like to spend a lot of time on this because it does really get into more of a social service model. But really, what I like about this model is that it really shows us that, down there at the bottom, primary prevention is key. And obviously, within our programs, we don't want any kind of trauma to come out of our programs, whether that be sexual abuse, whether it be physical abuse, whatever. And so if we are creating environments where it's safe, we're going to prevent abuse from happening within our programs. Obviously, a lot of times we are operating at the secondary level because we're dealing with families that are in need, and we are dealing with families where opportunities for prevention, or families or situations where opportunities for prevention were not present. And then obviously at the tertiary level, you're really dealing with the high end of children who are experiencing maltreatment. So why I like to share this one is because I think that if we as leaders within the Salvation Army can really operate with a mindset of primary prevention, we can do our part to ensure that abuse is not going to happen within our programs, but also that we are not going to re-traumatize children because we're not necessarily aware. We're not operating our programs with an awareness that there may be some trauma that's coming through our doors. Likely there is trauma coming through our doors, and how we could inadvertently trigger adverse responses. So Salvation Army Ministries operate within the microsystem. And so when we think about what our protective factors are, we are providing service to suffering humanity, which often operates in a secondary or tertiary model. We are serving people who did not have the benefit of primary prevention in whatever area of the microsystem that they come from. Our protective factors also come from our policies that we have. For the Central Territory, you have your Safe from Harm program, but there's also territorial and national minutes that really kind of speak into our policies at the territorial and divisional levels. Some programs are licensed or accredited; they have to be, and there are protective factors that come from being trauma informed. So my question to you, as you know, I'm obviously throwing a lot of information at you today, is to ask yourself, what role do you play in creating a culture of safety and well-being for anyone who enters in your program? And when you think about that, it's easy to become overwhelmed because it's like, what am I going to do? I'm not an expert on this information. How am I going to apply those 4 R's? What am I supposed to do? I think that the first step is being aware, and the first opportunity that we have to be aware is the opportunity that we have to begin to look at our programs a little bit differently, so that we can provide care that is trauma informed. Salvation Army ministries operate in the microsystem, but are influenced by other systems within the ecological model. We serve very many populations, and in some areas, we may have personnel that lack cultural competency between different cultures that are coming to our programs. We may have people that present risk factors because they're complicit with our policies and standards, or they're just frankly compliant with our policies, which does not necessarily mean that we are providing an environment that's safe. Compliance a lot of times means that we're checking a list. Yeah, we did the training. Yeah, we did this. Yeah, we did that. But are you really committed to ensuring that those policies and standards are living and active in your program so that you have safety? And the other risk factor is trauma-informed care. What is this? And, up until a couple years ago, that was my understanding as well too. I was not very well versed in it. I don't think I'm still well versed in it, but I'm educating myself on it because I think that it changes the way we approach different problems that we deal with in our programs. And you may just want to have a discussion, about what are some of the other risk factors that you would experience in your programs that could be influenced within the ecological model that could contribute more risk factors. If you have time, and this is up to your leadership, I don't know what time you have allotted for this. There is a TEDx video that I have shared with your leadership that if you have an opportunity to, if time permits, that this would be a great place to play that video and listen to the Dani Bostick story, and it's titled "A Voice for the Silent." I believe it's about 6 minutes, but that's up to your leadership. If not, if it doesn't fit in with your time frame, I'm going to share the links to those videos with your leadership, and they can get that to you, and you can watch it outside of the workshop. So as we roll into part 2 of trauma-informed ministries, Salvation Army Ministries, part 2 is focused on trauma-informed programming. And again, I just want to just reiterate that I am no expert in this, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but I don't want people to, if you disagree with anything that I'm saying or whatever, my research is based on what I've gathered from seminars, from conferences, and and what's available online. I know that there are professional certifying bodies out there that really prepare people, but in reality, I think that I probably represent most people who are working in the Salvation Army who are not going to have the opportunity or afforded the opportunity to be professionally trained in this area. It is quite expensive, but again, my goal today is for you to be aware. Diane Langberg talks about dungeons and chapels in a video that I'm also providing with this workshop, called Trauma as a Place of Service. And she says that often when we enter into another's suffering, we try to drag them into our world. We want them to think what we think, choose what we would choose, understand what we would see, and live more like we do. We want them to leave their depression, sorrow, and grief behind and just get over it. When we're dealing with trauma, or somebody who's affected with trauma, and I may be speaking to people who are living in a trauma-affected way right now. It's not as easy as just saying get over it. When we start to understand how trauma manifests within a person and even within a community, and even understanding that the world right now has been exposed to a pandemic that really, to a person who's already been traumatized, it's going to add to their trauma. For whatever reason, you probably discussed it in many of your meetings within your core, the thought of being isolated for, I don't know how many months it was in your territory or your respective areas. We were locked up in our house for almost 4 months before our office even opened up again to go back on a partial basis. We are missing the opportunities for human interaction with people, with opportunities to really socialize. Even to go to the grocery store is a chore. To be out in public, there's so many precautions that we have to follow. We're not allowed to be by people. And while we know that that is all contributing to ending this virus and not spreading the virus, we also understand that on the other side of that takes a huge toll on people emotionally, and especially for people who really need and desire to be around others. They thrive in those situations. So you can see it's not as easy as just saying get over it. We have to exercise and approach trauma with a lot more care than that. I find it interesting in my studies, when I was working on my child advocacy degree, in one of the textbooks, they talked about a tradition of skepticism. And basically what it was saying, and this was focused on child sexual abuse, and I found this very fascinating, that before the 1970s, much of the psychiatric and psychological, medical, and sociological writing on child sexual abuse downplayed the seriousness of the problem. And this is what they said. They were saying that child sexual abuse, number one, is the child's fault. Now, we know in today's understanding of this is that a child can never be to fault for the abuse that has come against them. Sorry about that. They also were stating that mothers were to blame for child sexual abuse, which obviously they're saying that because generally in those times, mothers were the ones that were spending the most time with the children. They were also stating that child sexual abuse is rare. So there was a sense of ignorance there, some complacency to think that it wasn't happening a lot. And they also said that child sexual abuse does not harm the child. And they also said that the child is lying. Well, I can share with you that in my education and everything that I know about this subject, from being trained by experts to just common sense. I think if you look at this list, uh, we know, as I mentioned before, child sexual abuse is never the child's fault. It's always the adult's fault or the perpetrator's fault. We know that mothers are not always to blame for child sexual abuse. Yes, child sexual abuse is generally perpetrated by somebody who is known to or related to the child, but that's not just the mothers. That could be the fathers, the uncles, the aunties. It could be the youth pastor. It could be the coach. Whoever's in that microsystem around the child could be abusing children. So we can't just say that it's the mothers. We know that child sexual abuse is, we know that the statement about child sexual abuse being rare is untrue. We are sitting in a seminar right now, workshop right now, about trauma and how it manifests in a child. We know that child sexual abuse and other forms of abuse and other traumatic events have a huge impact on children into their adulthood. The other thing that we all have to understand in youth ministry or in ministry to uh, in our programs is that generally what the statistic surrounding a child disclosing abuse turns out that less than 5% of those disclosures turn out to be false. So, so generally, if a child says that that they've been abused by somebody or they disclose it, um, chances are over 95% of the time they are telling the truth. And so I always like to pose the question to people that I'm training, whether it be on trauma or child abuse prevention: do we inadvertently adopt a skeptical mindset that asks an individual with trauma, what is wrong with you? And I think that as we kind of digest that, what we understand about the tenets of being trauma informed is that it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. Um, these thoughts uh, prior to the 1970s would probably explain a lot of things why so much research in today's age has come forth to really just kind of smash all of that thinking that was out there at that time. When we think about trauma-informed care in our core programs, and just looking at our own ecological model here, how are um, how are these entities operating uh, interchangeably with each other to ensure that the child is protected? So this is about child safety within our program. So the community that is around the child when they're at our core or at our programs, there's going to be family members, there's going to be peers, there's going to be pastors, youth workers, members if you're at a Croc Center or a larger community center core, and guests who may be coming onto the property. What are the protective factors, again, that we have within our organization? What are our policies? What is the culture of the population that we're serving? What is the program type? Sometimes some programs are higher risk than others, and with that comes the opportunity for higher opportunities for triggering trauma. If we're dealing with children who maybe don't want to do something, or if the program type is inappropriate for their age group, there's a lot of different things that we want to make sure that we're looking at as far as our organizational protective factors. And then what is society saying to us as an organization? What are the laws that say, what are the laws in your community saying about how we go about protecting children? The social conditions. What are the expectations of the public? I think it's always important to really consider these areas when we're focused on the child and their well-being and preventing any further trauma coming to them if they're already trauma affected. This is the following statement is very common to us in the Salvation Army, and that is save souls, grow saints, and serve suffering humanity. Sorry, I'm getting my tongue tied today. Save souls, grow saints, serve suffering humanity. We hear this a lot in the Salvation Army, and it really is a great way to encapsulate the ministry that we provide to the community. So when we think about trauma-informed Salvation Army programming, saving souls, growing saints, serving suffering humanity, what does that look through a trauma-informed lens? How can you do everything that you are required to do as a Corps officer, as a youth pastor, as a Croc program director, as a camp director, as a music director? How can you do all that is required of you and still be trauma-informed? It's overwhelming to think about that. But again, my goal today is for us to just begin thinking about it and being aware so that we may be able to respond to different circumstances differently. How do you come out of the chapel and take heaven down to the dungeons? And if you watch, if you guys have the opportunity to watch the Diane Langberg video, that statement will make sense to you. So I will just leave it with that one. How do we, and again, this part of this presentation was directed at child and vulnerable adult protection specialists or your safe from harm coordinators. How do we as child and vulnerable adult protection agents integrate trauma-informed care in our work and prevention efforts? And that really applies to anybody in leadership. How can we be more trauma-informed in how we provide programming for children and vulnerable adults? Here is a breakdown of the 4 R's that we mentioned earlier. And if you do research on the trauma-informed approach, you're going to see this as a recurring theme that comes up. And basically, as if we're aware of trauma and being trauma-informed, these are 4 things that are important for us to do. The 4 R's. First of all, the first step in understanding anything is to understand the widespread impact of trauma and the pathways to recovery. So while we're not going to be particular practitioners of trauma-informed care, while we're not going to be experts in this area, it's important to understand the widespread impact of that. And as we shared a little bit earlier in this presentation, we know that it comes from a lot of different places. Recognizing trauma signs and symptoms, this may not be easy, but a lot of times what we will see is that trauma is revealed through behaviors that may seem problematic. Responding. So how are we responding? By integrating knowledge about trauma into all facets of the system and for our ministry. And the 4th R, I think, is just as important as the first one, being aware. Resisting re-traumatization and of trauma-impacted individuals by decreasing the occurrence of triggers. This is challenging because we may not know what those triggers are. We may not know enough about the individual to know what that is. But what are we doing to resist re-traumatization within our programs? There are 5 key principles to creating a trauma-informed environment. And I think if you do some research, you may find 1 or 2 more, 7 key principles. But for the sake of this presentation, we'll just keep it at the 5. Number 1, creating areas that are calm and comfortable, ensuring physical, emotional, and spiritual safety. Essentially, going back to that culture of safety, creating an environment that's safe for everybody to be in. We do not want to do any harm in providing programs. Trust. It's important that we are providing clear and consistent information, establish and maintenance of appropriate boundaries around within our programs, around participants, around each other. Choice. Providing providing the individual for options in their treatment. Now, this does not necessarily apply to us because that may be more on the clinical side, where the advocate is working with a child who's trauma impacted. But we certainly can within the sphere of our programs. One of the things that I saw through a trauma presentation for camps was to look at your daily schedule. And within your daily schedule, in each component of that schedule, are there opportunities for trauma to happen? And are you providing your campers, within reason, options for how they're going about the programming? I think one of the big ones that I dealt with in camp a lot was, the staff always wanted the campers to get up on the stage. And we always had campers that were more than willing to do that. But that one or two campers that are like, no, this petrifies me, I don't want to get up on that stage. While we encourage them to do so, if they don't want to do that, we don't force them to do it. And that's respecting their boundaries, respecting their comfort zone so that they're not forced into doing something that may cause them more trauma. So it's something as simple as that. Collaboration, making decisions together, that kind of feeds into choice, involving others such as parents, family members, and advocates if you have access to that. One of the things that I always go to in youth ministry is that it's always more important to collaborate with the parents and guardians rather than not. Come alongside them. You're in a team with us together, and that's not always possible in our programs, but it's a great goal. One of the most important parts of addressing trauma impacted individuals is empowerment. Really, it is about building resiliency. And so if we're able to notice the capabilities of the individual, or we see that they're particularly good at something, or we see that they have strengths in a certain area, you never know how much impact you will have on somebody if you are able to step in and encourage and speak life into those skills or those strengths to really help them focus on those areas of their life, because that's going to obviously make them feel better. Re-traumatization. I seem to get my tongue tied around that one a lot. And this is what hurts. And so I don't want to be contradictory here, but we're talking about the system, and right there it says policies and procedures, the way that we do things. And I want to say up front that, I'm a big proponent of making sure that our child protection policies and procedures are in place and that we're following them and that it's supported from the top. And I will say that being trauma-informed does not mean that we are allowing people to come into our programs and because they are trauma-impacted, that we're letting them get away with things that make the environment unsafe. Every situation is going to be different, and we do have policies and procedures, but how are we administering our programs so that those policies and procedures are followed, but we're still creating that environment that is safe, again, on the emotional and the spiritual level. But also, I think that if somebody who's been dealing with trauma have to continually tell their story, that re-traumatizes. If they're being treated as a number or a statistic, that doesn't help them. We always have to exercise a higher level of caution when we are doing programs that require disrobing. So if we're going on outings, camping, whatever, that can be a particularly uncomfortable situation, especially for a child who may have been abused sexually by somebody or even physically. So making sure that we are respecting a child's privacy or even an adult's privacy when you have those activities when they need to change. Being seen as a label, if they're like ADHD or that person's an addict, instead of saying that is a child who has ADHD, not labeling them as what's going on in their lives. No choice in service or treatment, again, that's more on the clinical advocacy level. no opportunity to give feedback about their experience with service delivery. Again, that's probably more in the advocacy area, but when we think about how important it is for us within our ministries to take feedback that is coming from participants, to really listen to it closely. Especially, we can say, oh, well, that person always comes in and complains. We know that we've got folks like that come into our programs, but are we seriously listening to, what may be some of the root causes, or, but making sure that we're taking an opportunity to seriously listen to feedback that is coming as a result of our service. Continuing on with re-traumatization, what hurts in the relationship, power and control. If a person is not being seen or heard, or leaders are violating the trust of the participant, failure to ensure that emotional safety. There's an aspect of not being collaborative with the person, essentially saying we've got a behavioral issue with this person and they're not trying to collaborate to make things right. Doing things for rather than with, and a use of more punitive treatment, coercive practices, or oppressive language. And again, I just want to say that being trauma informed does not mean that we're throwing our policies and procedures out the door and letting people walk all over us. It's about really addressing these issues in a manner that recognizes the trauma that somebody may be experiencing. I've used this model a lot in camp training to really help camp staff really understand a behavioral continuum, and how we really want to work towards keeping our campers, and this applies to any programming, into that green zone. I think by looking at this, you probably automatically know that the green zone is where we want to be. That the yellow zone is where we are entering into an area of potentially risky behaviors that could be problematic for the organization or the participant. And of course, the red area, which is a harmful and abusive area. And so it's important to, trying to figure out ways to encourage people who are working with youth, especially in a residential situation, that your goal is always to try and keep them in the safe and protective area. And then when it starts to drift from that area, what kind of methods of redirection are you doing? And I also say in this area too, when we start to drift into a potentially risky area or a harmful and abusive area, what is the personnel's responsibility? How did they contribute to those behaviors moving in that direction? It's easy in a camp setting to say, obviously, summer staff members are going to get distracted a lot, and that requires leadership to make sure that they're redirecting them into their responsibilities. And generally, we're probably going to see most of our programs where we're kind of hanging out between that safe and protective and the potentially risky, but we're managing those behaviors as they come up. But when we slide fully into that yellow area and we're unable to redirect back into that safe and protective area, this is where we really need to start utilizing the tools that we have at hand. Is this where the call to the parent goes, or is this where we start contracting with the child to make sure that they're maintaining that behavior, and also doing it in a manner that recognizes that the behavior may be spurred by trauma in their lives or something that they're experiencing. And then obviously, when we start to slide into the harmful and abusive area, where the child becomes harmful to themselves or to others, we have to start making decisions at that point about, is it wise for us to keep this individual in our program if it's posing that a safety threat to others in the program? And hopefully that any kind of behavior modification system that you're doing is being done in concert with the parent or guardian, so that they know what's going on. Behavior modification Just like trauma-informed care, if you go online and try to look for tools for behavior modification, there's a lot of information out there. And if you've done youth work for any amount of time, you know that one shoe does not fit all. So there are some people that are naturally gifted in this, but I think that this diagram really helps us to really think about, we really want to make our goal to be keeping things safe and protective, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, so that we can properly facilitate our programs. Becoming trauma-informed means recognizing that people often have many types of trauma in their lives, as we established in the beginning. People who have been traumatized need support and understanding from those around them. Often trauma survivors can be re-traumatized by well-meaning caregivers and community service providers. I think that's important for us because that's probably where we're at. We're all well-meaning. We certainly don't want to re-traumatize anybody. We don't want to cause anybody harm. But that because it comes from our lack of education and understanding in the area. Understanding the impact of trauma is an important first step in becoming a compassionate and supportive caregiver or officer. For the application piece of this, you don't have to be an expert in trauma-informed care to be aware. How we interact with those in trauma needs to reflect Christ and his love. Obviously, that is so important for us to do. There are many resources for trauma-informed practice, schools, social service programs, etc. I believe that we need more resources for the church, but I do believe that the resources that are out there can be applied across all boards or all lines. And just a reminder, especially when you're dealing with behaviors that you just don't understand, it's not about what's wrong with the person, it's about what happened to them. And when you understand trauma a little bit better, you will hear that phraseology a lot. Back to our case study in the beginning, and this particular case, especially with the education and the experience that I have now, I seriously look at this case that happened in our camp, and there are a lot of things that I would have done differently had I been aware of being trauma informed. Certainly, one of the big one that sticks out in my mind is the staff member that said, "Oh, well, we should call the police" right in front of the child, which enraged him even more. And I don't blame my staff for the way they responded. I think that we were all caught off guard by this, and what we found with this particular child is that he never should have been at camp to begin with. We found out through the investigation that he was a part of one of our programs in Honolulu that especially dealt with children who could not function properly in the school system. And when I would go and do child safety assessments on that particular program, and we visited that department, I think I literally left there near or in tears because of the brokenness in there and the trauma that they. This is a program where they are trained and certified to deal with restraints and to deal with these behaviors. We had kids that would put their fists through plate windows, and they had the special rooms with the padding on it. It was just like, wow. This camper came to camp, the mom, and you can't fault her for wanting her kid to have a good camp experience. But the clinical director at the Family Treatment Services program never would have approved this child to come to camp because his behavioral issues were so intense. We found out through the investigation that he actually came at his teacher in public school with a pair of scissors, which is what landed him in this specialized program. And it always broke my heart about the conditions around that child, and that he was so enraged. To this day, and I've shared in training a lot, the picture that you see here on the screen is the actual water pitcher that camper tried to hit the program director with, and it ended up breaking on his arm with. I keep that in my office to this day, wherever my office is, as a focal point to remind me of what I'm called to do. And you'll see that there's a lei that is draped around that. And in Hawaii, if you're familiar with the culture out there, you see the lei a lot, but they greet you with it, they farewell you with it. It's a symbol of love. It's a symbol of celebration. But I keep that picture in my office as a reminder that many of the people that we serve are broken, and some of them very badly. And they are dealing with trauma that we may never understand. And it's a reminder that when we are trauma informed, we respond differently to the situations around us. And the lei, because of its representation, I have that draped over that water pitcher in my office as a reminder that the broken need to be wrapped in love, both ours and his, but it needs to be done in a safe way. As I've said, this particular case that happened in my camp has stuck with me for many years. And a few years ago, I decided to do some research to see if I could find where this camper was today. And, thinking that probably based on what we saw in camp, that it probably wasn't a good place. And that's an unfair assumption on my part. But what I did find in my research through social media and stuff was I found out that he was removed from the island of Oahu and was off on one of the other islands, but he graduated high school on the honors list. And I was so happy to hear that. And I hope and pray that Salvation Army programs contributed to him getting to that spot. And I saw that some of the stuff that he had done, that he obviously had some talent artistically, and he was practicing art and functioning in society. And I think that just made me feel so good, especially for all the years that I really fretted over what happened in that situation. And I was so pleased to see that. And I'd like to think that all of our situations that we deal with, especially those that stick out in our mind, have a nice ending like that. And so I leave that little case study with you to just say, we know what happens in our programs. Sometimes we handle things that are wrong, and we're not doing it on purpose. But there are always opportunities to learn from every situation that we do. And the investigators actually came back to us and said that. Our risk management department came back and said, our legal department came back and said, there are some things that we could have done differently here, but our staff did everything within their power to protect the other campers. And the investigation really came down to checking to see how we hired people, how we trained people, how we supervised campers. And so that stuff is all important because it comes into play when you're having to deal with situations like that. If you have time within this, I'm sharing the link with your leadership of Trauma as a Place of Service by Diane Langberg. It is a little bit longer than the other one. I think it's maybe 12 minutes. And again, if you don't get to see it in conjunction with this workshop, I would encourage you to take the link and watch it on your own. I think that her depiction of churches and dungeons is just fantastic in helping people who are in ministry understand trauma. If you do have time for some discussion, if you do get to watch those videos, I would encourage you to spend some time discussing what you have learned and how you might, apply that knowledge in your ministries. And then also just to look at what are some of your internal resources that you can tap into to learn more about being trauma informed. A lot of our social ministries departments have people that have probably got a lot more education and knowledge in this area. You may have personnel who are certified in trauma-informed care. And then also to look in your community. If you're running a core program, So look at some of those resources such as child advocacy centers that you can collaborate with. A lot of times we find that children's advocacy centers are more than willing to send somebody out to speak with your group or do some training with your folks. I think that they would be more than happy to reach out and uh, and do that. And there may be other resources in your community. Some of the resources that I would direct you to, number one is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have so many resources here, and a lot of their training is free, as well as their as well as their resources. So you can find just about everything you need to know about trauma on that site, and it's such a wonderful service for anybody who's in ministry to dealing with children in trauma. The National Children's Advocacy Center, there's a lot of resources there, and the Child Welfare Information Gateway. And of course, there's a lot of others, but these three are my go-tos. And I would encourage you to check out the National National Child Traumatic Stress Network. A lot of great information there. That's all I have for you today. Again, I know I threw a lot at you. Um, and as I continue to, I've never presented this workshop live. I've done it via Zoom or Teams, and I've done it recorded, such as this. And I really believe that this is an important subject matter, and I do think it's best facilitated live and in person. And I hope that I hope that when we get out of this pandemic, that this is going to be an excellent subject matter that we should all be talking about around our collective tables and our workshops, because I do believe, and I know that my peers in all four territories and in Canada, even at international headquarters, Child Protection Department, we are all concerned about what our world looks like on the other side of this pandemic and what we're going to have to be dealing with in the way of trauma. So I look forward to the day that we get to do this in person. Perhaps I will meet you someday. I just hope that you take this information and begin thinking about this. And if anybody has any questions or suggestions or any comments, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. And I just say God bless each one of you as you minister and become trauma informed. Thank you.